What's going on? It's Ben Brewster from Trade Athletics. I wanted to do a breakdown of Chase Petty today. He's one of the top arms in high school right now, likely going to go very high in this draft, first half of the first round, potentially. He's been up to 102 miles an hour recently. Pretty spectacular stuff. So I want to break down his mechanics a little bit and kind of explain how he's able to produce that type of velocity and just kind of give a different perspective on it. So first, some quick facts about Chase Petty. He's listed at 6'1", 200 pounds. He's class of 2021. He trains at Baseball Performance Center in New Jersey. They do a great job over there. His fastball ranges from 97 to 100. He's been up to 102. A recent bullpen, actually, he was sitting 101. So again, pretty absurd stuff. Mid-upper 80s slider, upper 80s changeup. One quote I found indicated that a lot of scouts comp him to Walker Buehler because he's not necessarily the biggest frame guy, but he still has that electric stuff and that electric arm speed. I actually think he reminds me a little bit more of like a high school Lance McCullers or Daniel Espino, both guys who topped 100 miles an hour in high school, and both guys who, as we'll discuss here in a second, generated their velocity from very extreme mobility and range of motion, as well as efficient patterns. So just in terms of the frames and how they're able to produce that velocity, again, I think McCullers was up to 102 in high school himself, and Espino has a lot of similarities too in how he uses his lower half. So for me, those are some good comps as far as other 100 mile an hour high school guys in the past decade. Another interesting tidbit I came across is Petty's actually sought out Jack Leiter and Al Leiter and through and tried to kind of learn and pick their brain a little bit. So there's a lot of good stuff that Jack Leiter does mechanically. We can talk about that in a different video. But again, just interesting that they've kind of trained together, and he sought him out and tried to pick up as much information there as he could regarding mechanics. So again, just interesting. Wanted to point that out. So let's just dive into the video. I'll let this run through a couple times just so we can kind of familiarize ourselves with these two clips. Again, a front view and a side view here. But I just want to go through the whole delivery, start to finish, and kind of point out what I'm seeing. So leg lift, there's a number of things we look for in the leg lift. We're looking for what is his posture doing. So as far as the upper half, we're looking for a relatively quiet head. We're looking for this stacked posture where there isn't necessarily a ton of movement through the upper half, and he's able to maintain that torso, the upright torso position over top of the pelvis rather than dipping forward or falling backwards. And he does that. You'll see his head stays relatively still. You'll see that the other thing he does very well is he gets what we call the drift. And most of you who are watching this video are familiar with this concept, have heard of the drift. But again, this is just a great look at it. If we look at his center of mass and we look at where he starts and where he ends from the beginning to the end of his leg lift, you can see that he gains that slight forward motion. So he's initiating that forward move through the center of his body, and he's beginning to move towards the plate even as he lifts his leg. So he's getting everything moving, he's getting everything going towards the target from the very first move, but without losing his posture, without losing this stable ground contact point. And another piece that we talk about all the time with the leg lift, that it's just something I've observed with the majority of hard throwers. Again, Daniel Espino would be a great comp. I'll throw him up in the video here too. But it's this posterior tilting of the pelvis during that forward move. So it's not just moving forward through the center of the body. You can see here, the pelvis kind of tucks under his torso as he gets that forward move. So I feel like this is more of kind of a preloading position. For me, this seems to help feel the ensuing linear move, the hinge, the dropping into the backside out of this drift, out of this leg lift. So he has this very athletic loop that he creates. He's shifting forward, he's tucking the pelvis underneath him athletically. But if we look at the path that this leg takes as he lifts it, it's almost creating this loop-like effect. He swings the leg up, shifts forward, and then it seamlessly transitions into the forward move. So it's not a choppy, forced leg lift coming from the hip flexor. It's not just the hip flexor lifting the leg and then lowering it and then moving forward. It's not all these individual pieces in isolation, but he's able to connect that initial leg lift to the next part of the delivery, which is that linear move, which is that hinge. So that's one way to think of it, is this leg lift is creating a loop of energy as he lifts it. And again, I'll just kind of draw that out here with the cursor. It's creating a loop that he captures into his ensuing linear move. So a lot of good stuff here with the leg lift and with that forward move. As he gets down the mound, we can go into his linear move here. Some of the things that he does very, very well here are he holds the ground and he holds his backside extremely well. So what we're looking for in this hinge or in this linear move is as the hips begin to move forward, we're looking for the head to be staying back. So as the hips begin to go forward, can he hold the upper half back in that stacked and loaded posture? And so this gets back to this concept of linear separation. So if we look at it from the front, this concept of rotational separation is, okay, we're separating the pelvis from the torso in the transverse plane. The hips are rotating one way and the torso is rotating the other way. That's how we traditionally think of hip-shoulder separation. That's a transverse plane separation. But the other way that you can build tension and stretch that spring or compress that spring prior to the unload is to create this separation in the frontal plane. And so as the hips begin to move forward and the upper half stays back, it creates this dissociation and this tension through the center of the body in the frontal plane as well. And so he's able to do that extremely well. And one of the reasons he's able to do that is because he has this stable back foot position. So if we watch his back foot as he gets into his linear move, all through this range right here, he's able to demonstrate this type of mobility and this type of move first and foremost because he's able to have a stable ground contact point. So this is when it gets kind of crazy, because what we're looking for ideally is, can you stay into the backside as long as possible down the mound? Can you hold the pelvis loaded over the backside, keep the upper half back and stacked as far as you can until you run out of room in that rear hip? That's what triggers the pelvis to unload, and that's what triggers the unloading process. So how long can you stay in that hinge? That's really the question. And what's interesting about Chase Petty is that he's able to stay in his hinge longer than anybody I've ever seen. This goes for Aroldis Chapman, this goes for Jordan Hicks. Daniel Espino comes close. Again, a super hypermobile guy, does full side splits easily. He's a guy with crazy mobility who throws 100, and he comes close to this. But I have never seen somebody that can stay into their backside so long. This is probably a pretty typical length of being able to stay in the hinge right here. Let's look at how much longer he's able to hold that position. 1, 2, 3, 2 to 3 frames longer. And if we look at this position right here, he's almost in kind of a side split position. I doubt most people watching this video, if they took their shoes off, tried to get in the side split position, saw how far they could get, I doubt most of you guys could even get to this position, trying to do a full stretch. And he's able to do that dynamically and just float through these positions and really hold that tension, hold that hinge extremely long. And this is, I feel, the outlier factor for him. This is the thing that really sets him apart mechanically from other 95-mile-an-hour throwers in high school, or other even mid or upper 90s guys, right? There's something that's an outlier about his mechanics. This is what I feel it is. This is the thing that really stands out, that sets him apart from even other 100-mile-an-hour guys in the big leagues that you see, who are much more physical, taller, longer levers, stronger. They don't consistently throw as hard as him. And again, this is a differentiating factor. So extremely exceptional right there. But if we break it down, what it actually takes to get into that kind of position, to be able to stay back this long and basically tension this spring, to be able to unload it as late as he does, it requires outrageous mobility, first and foremost. But what does that mean? Well, it requires mobility in all the structures that contribute to that position. So first and foremost, bony anatomy. You have a certain amount of room in your hip socket, and everybody has a different amount of room, and the orientation of our femur to our pelvis is different. And so some people have more room in external rotation. Some people have a different pelvic and hip structure and they have more room in internal rotation. Some people have a lot of room into hip abduction. Some people are extremely hypermobile and have a lot of rotation in both directions, a lot of hip abduction, but they're not stable. They don't have the control or the strength in that range to utilize it. They might be great at yoga, but they could never demonstrate it in something athletic like pitching. So first and foremost, you need that actual range in your hip socket. Obviously, this isn't something that most of us are going to be able to go out and change, but that is the first thing, that he has a ton of room in that hip socket to even be able to get into some of these positions. The second is, even if you do have the bony anatomy factor, you still need the tissue compliance. You still need all the muscles that surround the hip joint that contribute to being able to get into those positions. They need to be able to elongate and not protect, not inhibit you being able to get into that movement. So the adductors specifically, the deep hip rotators, the hamstrings, all these things need to be able to elongate and extend for him to be able to get in these positions. This is why for guys who struggle with stride length or staying into their hinge, we will do with a lot of our pitchers various adductor stretching and strengthening routines and various hip rotation mobility routines as well, to be able to stay into that linear move a little bit longer. End range strength is another piece of it. Again, just doing a bunch of foam rolling for your adductors isn't enough. It's not just about statically holding positions and improving tissue quality. You also need the strength at that end range to be able to actually demonstrate that in an athletic event or an athletic action. So you need strength at this end range, right? It's not just about holding a yoga pose for 20 minutes. Can you actually support your body weight in that position and be able to power through these positions with sequencing and with athleticism? So he's got obviously very good functional strength, or strength in that specific joint angle, to be able to effortlessly flow through these positions. And then you also have to have the athleticism to actually sync everything up, sequence it all, and utilize that strength, that tissue compliance, and the range that your bony anatomy gives you, and coordinate it all together. And that's the motor control piece of it. And that's the skill piece of it, that again, he's an outlier there. He's able to coordinate his body so efficiently, so effectively here, and actually make use of this capacity that he has in his lower half. So again, this is why it's so difficult to get into some of these positions. I think this is a 1 in 10,000 position. There's other hypermobile pitchers that could potentially do this, but again, maybe they don't have the athleticism to actually demonstrate it. And again, the takeaway from this slide is you can improve tissue compliance. You can improve end range strength. You can't really change your bony anatomy, obviously, unless you have, FAI and you get surgery to actually clean that up and restore you to your original bony anatomy. You can improve athleticism to some extent. So this is something that can be trained, but even with all the appropriate training protocols that we implement with our guys, this is still an exceptional position that is very difficult to get into, that most will not be able to hold their lower half as long as he does. And it's just awesome to see, and it's just an example of an outlier position that makes him so efficient. So moving through the rest of his delivery, getting into the unload, again, because he's been able to build this momentum down the mound while still staying fully loaded back, stacked and tall with his upper half, he's able to have this very late snapping open of his pelvis. And so what you'll see and what we look for is, does the knee extend, or does the knee snap down to the ground, and does the pelvis snap open, which slingshots the torso into ball release. And so what you'll see is there's a very clear snapping down of the knee, and there's a very clear internal rotation of the backside, and there's a very clear snapping open of the pelvis. You can see here from the front, even right here, his torso is still closed. There's very little movement or unload happening from the torso until right here. Right, this frame right here, right there, is when he starts to unload. That unload starts to make its way through his torso. But again, he's only 2 frames before landing at that point. So he's fully loaded until 2 frames before landing, when he actually triggers that unload. He's still loaded here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So between 2 and 4 frames before landing, he's still fully loaded. So he's able to get this very late snapping action of his pelvis open without extending, without triple extending, without having to push off the rubber. He's able to capture this rotation extremely well. Another sign that he's doing this is we can look at the ankle. And what is the ankle doing? Now, if you're a guy who pushes off, this ankle is going to extend, the knee is going to extend, the hip's going to extend, and you're going to ruin your ability to rotate. You might still throw 95, but you're not going to optimize what you could be doing. You're not going to optimize the actual rotational energy flowing through the system. And so what you'll see with the hardest throwers is that this ankle turns over as they keep trying to hold the rubber, and then ultimately they run out of room in their hip at some point and the pelvis goes. As it begins to rotate, it spirals its way down the chain and it turns that ankle over. And so you'll see right here, this is called ankle eversion. It turns the ankle over. And so that's just another sign of what's happening and that he's able to unload through rotation rather than through pushing or extension. If we go to actual landing and we look at what his lead leg does, we're looking for his lead leg to stabilize from this point. From landing, you ideally don't want to see that knee begin to move any closer towards the target. In his case, he has, an inch of slippage here, and that could just be the shoes he's wearing, that could be the mound, that could be something kind of more inherent to his mechanics, and maybe a very, very slight inefficiency. But you can see right here, from landing to the very next frame, that knee doesn't quite stabilize. And then after the following frame, it does stabilize. So if anything, that's really the only minor inefficiency that you'll see, at least in this particular side view from this one bullpen. If we look at his arm action, what we're looking for with arm action is typically how well do they utilize the momentum from their handbrake to spiral the arm up into that flip up position. So how well and how smoothly and seamlessly do they break the hands and allow the arm to spiral up that staircase and get into that flipped up position. And the flipped up position is just what it sounds like. It's that position where the forearm gets vertical, or at the very least 45 plus degrees of external rotation right around landing. And so he's right in that range. He's at about 45, maybe 55 degrees of external rotation at landing. Again, right in the ideal range that you look for. So this is that flip up position. You're looking for daylight between the forearm and between the head. You're also looking for the shoulders to be fully closed. And so because of this, he's in this position of scapular retraction. His scaps are pinched together. His humerus is even further back. This is called horizontal abduction. And so he's created this huge stretch, this huge velocity potential through the pec on his throwing arm. This huge stretch through his obliques, through his abdominals, and through that pec. And he's stabilized on the lead leg. And so everything has been completely loaded at this point. And interestingly enough, he's gotten there without energy leaks. He's gotten there without hitches or lags in his arm action. And so that's a big reason we look for how do they get to that position? How does the arm spiral from handbrake through the arm path into that flipped up landing position? You're trying to minimize energy leaks. Jacob deGrom would be one great example of a very efficient arm spiral, arm path. Blake Snell would be another great example. There's a ton of great examples in the big leagues, but again, Petty is no exception here. But one thing that, again, stands out with his mechanics, it's not a 1 in 10,000 position, but this is a very elite position, is the amount of daylight, the amount of scap loading, the amount of horizontal abduction he's able to create. Because now at this point, he's able to apply force over such a long range of motion. He's got the hips open, shoulders closed, and the arm is so far back that he's able to apply force from this position right here, where the ball is, all the way to here. That's a very long arc of motion that he's able to apply force to the baseball. If you imagine someone who lands already a little bit open with their shoulders and the ball is maybe right behind their head, they're only able to apply force to the ball over a very short range of motion before they have to actually release that ball. And so he's able to really maximize his velocity because of the range over which he can apply that effective force to the baseball. Shifting gears for a second, we can take a look at his glove arm. What we typically look for with the glove arm is it to work in opposition to the throwing arm. Now, I could use the terminology perfectly mirroring the throwing arm. But again, I don't particularly agree with that terminology because there isn't an exact mirroring of the throwing arm and the glove arm. So I prefer to use the terminology, they work in opposition. And what that means is, yes, they're not going to perfectly mirror each other, but they are going to somewhat resemble each other. And what that means is the timing of when, as you can see, the timing of when the throwing arm and the glove arm begin to extend is very similar. The degree of extension that both create is very similar. Both reach full elbow extension, right? You typically would not want to see a throwing arm that has a very short arm path stuck at 90 degrees, but a glove arm that's very long and extended, or vice versa. You think back to like a Joe Kelly, who has a short arm action. His glove arm works in opposition. He has a short glove arm and a short throwing arm. Chase Petty has a long throwing arm and a long glove arm. And so they work in opposition. You can see the angle that both create roughly work in plane with one another. And so because of that, he's able to properly sequence the glove arm with the throwing arm, and both of them wrap into this plane of rotation as his torso begins to rotate. The glove arm and the throwing arm perfectly sink into that plane of rotation as he does begin to unwind the torso after landing. And so again, he unwinds in plane, the elbow is right in line with the shoulders, and the arm takes this helical path, the spiral path out and around into ball release, where he releases with very close to full elbow extension right in plane. Again, a common issue we'll see is certain athletes will cheat their arm slot, especially if they're chasing vertical break, with maybe a Rapsodo bullpen where they're trying to chase those numbers on the Rapsodo, and they'll cheat that elbow 3, 4, 5, 6 inches above where their shoulders are. That's not a good position. That puts the humerus in a compromised position. That potentially contributes to impingement issues as well, and doesn't allow the arm to create effective layback. One thing we'll talk about here in a second with Chase is his clavicular positioning. He's a guy who has a little bit of a depressed scapula, a little bit of a depressed clavicle from some of the stuff I was reading and also just observing pictures of him. You could argue that his elbow is a hair below the line of his shoulders here, and that you might want it to be slightly higher. Again, it's difficult to tell with his shirt on, but you could make the argument his elbow is a ½ inch, an inch low at this point. Again, nothing hugely concerning for me. He's pretty close to being in that right range, but again, that's something to potentially keep an eye on, in my opinion. He is a guy who has a little bit of a lower release height, at 5'4". You can see he's a low 3/4 arm slot here. Again, I alluded to that he does seem to have a little bit of a flatter clavicular angle, as one article discussed, and talking to his trainer. You can see in this picture right here, just from the photo, you can kind of see how the right clavicle and the right scapula sit significantly lower than on the left side. And this is actually not unique to him. This is pretty common in high school and college and even professional pitchers, is that you see this adaptation. And so you can kind of trace out where his clavicles would be. You can see that on his left side, he does appear to have a little bit of clavicular elevation. Everybody's built differently. Everybody has a slightly different structure. But in general, you would want to see a slight upward slope to those clavicles. And what you'll typically see and what you see in Chase is that his throwing side is more horizontal, it's more flat, and it's more depressed. So that scapula, that clavicle, the entire shoulder complex on his throwing arm side, on his dominant side, has been dragged down and is being depressed. Now, this can, over time, become an issue for certain pitchers. I'm not going to get into it too much in the video, but one very easy workaround, and for certain guys that just naturally have a little bit more of this posture, myself included, is to drop the arm slot a little bit. So for me, I've always felt more comfortable having a slightly lower arm slot, and I haven't responded that well. My shoulder hasn't responded that well to trying to raise the arm slot significantly above that. So that could just be a natural arm slot for him that feels the most comfortable. As we'll talk about in a second, looking at some older footage of him throwing, that's likely his natural arm slot, because his older footage of his mechanics do show an even lower arm slot than he has right now. So again, these are all connected, and the basic premise is that our anatomy and our our structure dictates our function. It dictates how we are able to demonstrate our current structure in our mechanics, in athletic movements and athletic patterns. These things are all exposed and all on display when we actually put them through our mechanics. And so you will see when assessing athletes, you'll see various hip imbalances or T-spine imbalances or whatever. You'll see those show up at different places in their mechanics. And in his case, I don't think it's an issue that he is a low slot guy. I'm not saying he's going to get hurt, but what you will typically see is you can restore this clavicular angle in a lot of cases if you're able to diagnose what's dragging that side of their body down. Sometimes it's the lat is a little bit tight. Sometimes the pec minor is a little bit tight, needs a little bit of love. Sometimes the pelvis is a little bit misaligned as well. And so that is something that can be addressed, just very long term, just to make sure that things are in a little bit more of a neutral position. But again, just wanted to kind of make that connection and explain this isn't necessarily something unique to him. It's very, very common to see one side significantly more depressed than the other side. The next thing I want to discuss is his overall rhythm, tempo, and connection. So we've broken down his leg lift, his forward move, his unload, his arm action a little bit, and kind of shown some of the positions and the efficiency there. But it's really difficult to fully appreciate the rhythm, the tempo, or the overall sequencing and connection of the delivery as a whole. How do they really transfer that energy through their body? You can see the energy transfer if you look at it in full speed. And so just playing a clip here of him throwing in full speed, you get a better appreciation for it's not just positions. It's not just, hey, he gets into this one static position that looks great on a still frame. It's how does he seamlessly tie this all together with athleticism? And that's on display here. That's what we can see when we play the full speed clips. And so for me as a coach, it's so important to be able to have both. To be able to break a guy down frame by frame, see the positions, but to also have a full speed clip to be able to see how they tie it all together. So the next question I asked myself when making this video was, okay, has Chase Petty just always had amazing mechanics and he finally just kind of grew into them, and that's where the velocity came from? He just always had them. And so then talking to his coach, I got some footage of him when he was 14 years old. But just for some context, some coaches, some kind of pitching gurus have said for a long time that they feel that your mechanics are ingrained by age 13, 14, 15 years old, because you've made so many tens of thousands of throws over the course of your lifetime that it's borderline impossible to change your patterns, right? That was the claim going around when I was 15, 16, 17, trying to figure this stuff out myself, trying to fix my patterns. That was a claim, and it was hiding behind this idea of motor learning research that you just can't make meaningful changes to your patterns after a certain age. So Petty's a great example, because if that were the case, you would expect his mechanics a few years earlier to be extremely clean, extremely efficient. But what we actually see is this clip right here. And I'll just play it through a couple times so that you can see. But what you'll see just going through it frame by frame is that, yeah, he's clearly an athletic kid. He's got some rhythm through his leg lift, but he has some pretty major inefficiencies. He extends off the back leg. He doesn't ride his backside well. His elbow is extremely low at landing. His shoulders have already flied open. He scoops the elbow down into release and gets underneath the ball. You can see he has a linear finish where that back knee collapses and kicks in, and he has this linear forward crunching motion to the target. I mentioned his low arm slot before. You can see it right here. Again, extremely low with the arm slot, not a problem in and of itself, but how he gets there, how he creates it is a problem. And so he's a clear example that your mechanical patterns at a certain age don't define what's possible. His mechanics were relatively inefficient several years ago, and now he throws 100 miles an hour with some of the cleanest mechanical patterns I've ever seen. And so he had that potential in him. he just wasn't able to express that and move his body through space and time and coordinate it at that point in time to be able to really demonstrate it. And so this clearly, if this doesn't disprove that, you know, the motor learning theory that you cannot change your mechanical patterns after age 13 or 14, I don't know what does. Because when I was coming up, I kind of bought into this concept from these gurus that said this and made it sound hopeless. If you just didn't happen to be brought up and have perfect patterns, it made it sound hopeless. And you know, that's what I bought into for a couple of years and wondered if it could be really realistically changed. And obviously what we found is that you can change your mechanics, you can improve them past a certain age, and you can totally transform how you move. But again, your mechanics are a demonstration of your structure, of your strength, and of the skill component as well. So your mechanic can be improved, especially if it's a sequencing issue and not a structural issue. If there's a bony structural issue and you just only have so much range in your hip joint, there's only so much you can do to change. You can't change that, so there's only so much you can do. You have to work around that within your mechanics. And so Chase Petty, he's a pretty hypermobile guy. I wouldn't use him as a mechanical guide if I were an athlete watching this who didn't have his type of mobility. You'd want to find an example of an MLB pitcher who does have similar mobility restrictions, does have similar structure. Justin Verlander is an example of a guy without good hip internal rotation who still throws 100. And so a guy like that is much more valuable to study for someone with his type of structure, because his mechanics are a manifestation of the structure and function that he's dealing with. Chase Petty is dealing with a different set of, you know, body structure, lever lengths, size, etc. And so his mechanics are a manifestation of that. And just an interesting quote I found in a Petty interview, you know, just kind of drew a parallel here to something I posted from Jacob deGrom very recently. But he said on his mechanics that the biggest difference is whenever he throws hard, everything feels so smooth and so clean. He said when he was hitting 95, it felt good, but it didn't feel perfect. When he's hitting 100, everything feels so smooth. I feel like that's the biggest thing. And this is exactly, almost word for word, what Jacob deGrom said in a recent interview on what he's done to get his velocity increase year over year, and what feels different this year and last year versus years prior when he wasn't averaging 99 plus miles an hour. And again, he said it was smoothness. It was efficiency, smoothness, and it felt perfect. And that's how it looks, and it's interesting to see that that's exactly how it feels. And that's my experience with this concept as well, is I've never thrown as hard as Chase Petty. I have sat over 97.5 miles an hour in bullpens before. And again, those types of throws, those days, the difference is smoothness. The difference is sequencing. It's not that you know, suddenly got that much more fast twitch and suddenly got stronger. It's those specific days, and when you can sequence everything and tie that energy together and sequence it through your body with rotation, it actually feels amazing. It feels efficient. It feels smooth. And so seeing that it looks great, but then also hearing him say that it feels internally that efficient and that smooth, again, just a sign of he's really just transmitting this energy through his body extremely efficiently. So I want to end the video discussing this question that might seem rather obvious to people watching this. And the question is Petty a freak? Right? It seems like a very obvious answer. Well, yeah, of course, he's throwing 100. Everybody throwing 100 is a freak. And that's not wrong, but I want to give a little bit of a different perspective on this question. Because when I hear someone just say, oh, they're a freak, that's why they throw hard, that's a cop-out, in my opinion, because that doesn't actually dig deeper to see how are they able to perform at the level they're able to perform, right? We just tend to think of anyone who's an outlier as a freak. And I think that can be valid, but on the surface, that's not deep enough. That's not deep enough for those of us who are trying to figure out how to do that ourselves, or at least maximize what our genetics will allow us to be capable of. That's not enough. And so for me, I have a hard time answering that question, yes or no, because I think freaky isn't really a black and white label, right? The real question is, where is he freaky, or where is he an outlier? Because what you'll find when you take these guys who are outliers and you break it down is that very rarely are 100-mile-an-hour throwers, or outliers in general, outliers in everything, right? Chase Petty isn't the biggest guy, best levers, best everything, right? Best power output, best strength. he's not an outlier across the board. And so the question is, where is he an outlier? How do all of these different variables stack up, and what's the 1 or 2 or 3 that really stand out above the rest that do explain why he's able to be an outlier? And that helps us understand performance better. So we look at his size. His size is average to below average when you compare him to other 95+ mile-an-hour throwers. 6 foot to 6'1", 200 pounds. That's a little bit below average for a big leaguer. Obviously he's in high school, so it's good for high school, but comparing him to mid-90s throwers, his size is average. So that's not his outlier factor, right? We train plenty of guys. We train hundreds of professional guys, hundreds of college athletes who have bigger and taller frames than Chase Petty and don't throw nearly as hard as him. His levers also relatively average. He doesn't appear to have an outrageous wingspan compared to other 95+ mile-an-hour throwers. Sometimes you'll have someone like Aroldis Chapman where they're 6'4", 6'5", but they have proportionally very long arms and legs, and that helps contribute to how they're able to do what they do. Petty appears to have relatively proportional arms and legs, and so his levers don't appear to make him an outlier. His strength is good. In talking to his coach, he does hit our strength thresholds, the strength thresholds that we set for our guys to be able to throw 95+. They're not hard requirements, but they're recommendations to check those thresholds off the list as far as, you know, being strong enough in the vast majority of cases. His deadlift is reportedly 495, squat 335, and split squat 245. These are all right in line with our strength thresholds that we've talked about all the time for our throwers. And so he hits these thresholds. Strength is good, but again, you go into any college weight room and half the pitchers can do all this, and none of them throw 100 miles an hour. So again, that's not his outlier area. Power is also good. Obviously it's good if he's throwing 100, but he's a guy with a vertical jump of 27 inches. That's not off the charts compared to other 95+ mile-an-hour guys. We have guys that vertical jump 40 inches and don't throw even 98. And so he's a fast switch guy. He's strong. He's got average levers, and he's an average size. So far, nothing's explaining why his velo jumps off the table until we get to here, until we look at his mobility. His mobility is exceptional. He's able to create that crazy amount of scap retraction and horizontal abduction. So he gets his arm back into very deep positions. He's able to create very extreme ranges of separation. But then, as we talked about, it's really that ability and that hip mobility that allows him to stay in his backside as long as he does, delay that pelvic rotation, and build that potential kinetic energy down the mound. That really does make him an outlier. That's the position. And thinking back to Daniel Espino, Lance McCullers in high school, those guys get into similar, extremely crazy positions as similarly not outlier physical athletes as far as their size and levers. That help explain their velocity as well. So his mobility is exceptional. That is one of the things that begins to make him an outlier. But again, his mechanics are elite. His mechanics, which require that mobility to perform, are elite. It's how he's able to take that mobility. There's lots of hypermobile pitchers out there. I don't know the exact number. Maybe it's 1 in 20, 1 in 30, 1 in 50. There's lots of hypermobile pitchers out there, but very few of them are able to tie it all together with such efficiency as Chase Petty does. So his mechanics are another thing that make him an outlier when combined with his mobility. And then the ability to do that, the ability to take that mobility and sequence it into elite mechanics requires this athleticism. And that the athleticism is, again, I would call exceptional. I don't know if it's elite because I don't personally know or have trained Chase Petty. But again, he can just do backflips. He's reported to be extremely athletic as well, and he has to be. To move this way dynamically off the mound, you have to have extreme levels of athleticism. And so this is, you know, reminds me of someone like Tim Lincecum in college when he was throwing 102 miles an hour. The level of athleticism, hearing that he could do backflips easily as well. When you start to break it down, you can start to really identify what makes someone an outlier. Because again, it's not that they're an outlier across the board in most cases. When you do have someone who's an outlier across the board, you start to have someone like Aroldis Chapman with the size, the levers, crazy strength, crazy power, crazy mobility, crazy mechanics, and crazy athleticism. now you've got someone who throws 105 miles an hour. And so that's pretty uncommon. In most cases, there's 1 or 2 or 3 variables that are extreme outliers, and the rest are just simply good or above average. And that's enough in combination to make someone an outlier. So again, we've talked about this. Hypermobile pitchers aren't that rare in and of themselves. Strong pitchers aren't that rare. There's plenty of stronger college pro and pro pitchers than Chase Petty. He's very, very strong for a high school kid, but there are plenty of stronger pitchers that don't throw that hard. There's plenty of guys who throw 82 who are significantly stronger than him. But it's that combination. It's being simultaneously hypermobile, strong, powerful, and having elite mechanics and athleticism. It's that combination that makes the difference, and that's what, in my opinion, makes him special. And that's what makes him a freak, is that combination. It's not, hey, he's just a freak. It's the combination, as we break it down, of which are those specific outlier factors. Guys, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give this video a like. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you get notified of any future videos that we upload. Again, if you like this content, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought. And I look forward to hearing some suggestions for future breakdowns, future content. And again, if you guys ever have any questions regarding your own training, or if you're a coach and you have questions regarding your own philosophy and how you coach your athletes, we are very responsive to our emails. We're here to help, we're here to educate. So go ahead and shoot an email to contact@triathletics.com with any questions you've got. Thanks again, and I'll see you guys in the next video.